The Chevrolet 305. Just saying those numbers out loud is enough to make hot rodders roll their eyes, performance enthusiasts groan, and muscle car purists shake their heads in disappointment. It's been called weak, boring, smog-choked, and a total disaster. Some folks say it's the worst small-block Chevy ever made. But here's the thing nobody talks about. This controversial, misunderstood engine actually saved General Motors during one of the darkest periods in American automotive history. So today, we're setting the record straight on the Chevrolet 305 V8, the engine that became GM's corporate lifeline, powered millions of cars and trucks, and somehow managed to ruin its own reputation while doing exactly what it was designed to do. To understand why the 305 exists, we need to go back to the mid-1970s. This was a brutal time for American car manufacturers. The 1973 Arab oil embargo had sent gas prices through the roof, and suddenly those big-block muscle cars that everyone loved were sitting on dealer lots collecting dust. Nobody wanted a car that got 8 miles per gallon when gas was rationed and lines at the pump stretched for blocks. But it wasn't just the oil crisis. The federal government was tightening the screws with new regulations. The Clean Air Act of 1970 demanded lower emissions. Then came CAFE standards in 1975, Corporate Average Fuel Economy, which forced automakers to hit fleet-wide fuel economy targets or face massive fines. By the late 1970s, GM had to average 27.5 miles per gallon across their entire lineup by the mid-1980s. Think about that for a second. This is the same company that had been building 454 cubic inch big blocks, 427s, and high-compression 350s. Now they had to figure out how to sell V8 power while meeting impossible fuel economy standards with technology that was basically Stone Age compared to what we have today. The solution? Make the engines smaller, way smaller. In 1976, Chevrolet introduced the 305 cubic inch V8 as a replacement for the old 307 and the venerable 283. The goal was simple. Create an economical V8 that could deliver smooth power, meet emissions standards, and share as many parts as possible with the popular 350 to keep production costs down. The 305 used the exact same stroke as the 350, 3.48 inches, but Chevy shrunk the bore down to 3.736 inches instead of the 350's 4-inch bore. That 0.264-inch difference in bore size doesn't sound like much, but it dropped displacement from 350 cubic inches down to 305. The idea was that this smaller displacement would burn less fuel and produce fewer emissions while still giving buyers the V8 experience they wanted. And here's where things get interesting. The 305 wasn't designed to be a performance engine. It was designed to be a corporate workhorse, an affordable, reliable, fuel-efficient V8 that could be mass-produced cheaply and installed in everything GM made. Early versions made somewhere between 140 and 145 horsepower with a 2-barrel carburetor. To put that in perspective, a 1966 283 with a 2-barrel carb made 190 horsepower. The 305 was making less power from more displacement than engines from a decade earlier. But remember, this was the era of smog motors and strangled performance. Every manufacturer was dealing with the same problem. By the early 1980s, something remarkable happened. The 305 didn't just survive, it became GM's corporate standard V8 engine. During this period, if you bought almost any GM car with a V8, you were getting a 305. It was in Camaros, Firebirds, Monte Carlos, Caprices, Malibus, El Caminos, Cutlasses, and even in trucks and SUVs. The 305 and Oldsmobile's 307 became the dominant V8s across the entire GM lineup. And here's the kicker. In 1980, when California emission standards got even stricter, Chevrolet couldn't certify the 350 for sale in California. So for that 1 year only, even the Corvette, America's sports car, came with a 305 if you lived in California. A 5.0-liter Corvette making 180 horsepower. That's how serious the emission crisis had become. The 305 was installed by the millions. GM put it in everything because it was cheap to build, it shared tons of parts with the 350, it met emission standards, and it gave customers a V8 option when the alternative was often a weak six-cylinder or a troublesome diesel. Now let's talk about why this engine had such a terrible reputation, because the complaints are very real. First, that small bore. At 3.736 inches, the 305 cylinders are narrow. This creates a fundamental problem with airflow. You can't install the larger 2.02-inch intake valves that were standard on Performance 350 heads because the valve would literally crash into the cylinder bore. The biggest intake valve you can safely run is about 1.94 inches, and even that's pushing it. Most 305 heads came with 1.84-inch intake valves. Smaller valves mean restricted airflow. Restricted airflow means less power, especially at high RPM. For hot rodders trying to build horsepower, this is a deal breaker. A 350 with its 4-inch bore can breathe much better, can support bigger valves, and can make more power with the same modifications. Second major problem, the camshaft. Many 305 engines came with what's affectionately known as the peanut cam, one of the smallest, mildest camshafts GM ever installed in a V8. The intake duration on some of these cams is less than 180 degrees at 0.050-inch lift. That's pathetically small. It was designed for low-end torque and fuel economy, not performance. Third, premature camshaft failure. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, the 305 earned a reputation for wiping out camshaft lobes prematurely. This was partly due to GM's cost-cutting and quality control issues during manufacturing, and partly because the newer engine oils were removing zinc and phosphorus compounds that flat-tappet camshafts desperately needed for proper break-in and lubrication. So, you've got an engine with a small bore that restricts airflow, a tiny camshaft that kills top-end power, and a tendency to eat camshafts. No wonder hot rodders wanted nothing to do with it. If you had a 305 under your hood, the general advice was simple: yank it out and drop in a 350. Even a stock 350 would outperform most 305s. But here's where the 305 story gets more interesting. GM didn't give up on performance entirely. During the 1980s, they created several high-output versions that could actually move. The LU5 Crossfire Injection 305 appeared in 1982, using dual-throttle body injection and a higher compression ratio of 9.5 to 1. It made 165 horsepower. Not great, but better than the base engines. However, the Crossfire system earned the nickname Ceasefire because of reliability issues and poor dealer knowledge about how to service it. Then came the L69 high-output 305 in 1983. This was the Hot Rod 305. It featured that 9.5 to 1 compression ratio, a performance-tuned Rochester Quadrajet 4-barrel carburetor, a more aggressive camshaft borrowed from the Corvette, and a knock sensor to prevent detonation. The L69 made 190 horsepower at 4,800 RPM and 240 pound-feet of torque. Chevy put it in the Monte Carlo SS, Camaro Z28, and Pontiac Firebird. Finally, the 305 had some attitude. Then in 1985, GM introduced the LB9 Tuned Port Injection 305. This system used a large aluminum plenum with long individual intake runners feeding each cylinder. The TPI system was designed for low-end torque production, and it worked. The LB9 made 215 horsepower initially. Later versions bumped that to 230 horsepower. More importantly, the torque curve was fat and strong down low, making these cars feel much quicker than the number suggested. The TPI 305 powered the third-generation Camaro IROC Z and Pontiac Firebird through the late 1980s and early 1990s. These cars could turn high 14-second, low 15-second quarter-mile times in stock form and reach top speeds near 150 miles per hour. Not bad for an engine that everyone said was garbage. Let's be honest about what the 305 actually was. A reliable, economical, smooth-running V8 that did exactly what GM designed it to do. It wasn't built to compete with big blogs or even hot 350s. It was built to get people to work, haul light loads in trucks, and deliver decent performance while keeping gas mileage in the teens instead of single digits. And it succeeded. The 305 was incredibly reliable when maintained properly. Truck versions of the 305 lasted until 2003 as the Vortec 5000, powering Chevy and GMC trucks and sedans. These engines routinely racked up 200,000 miles or more with basic maintenance. They weren't fast, but they didn't break. For average drivers who just wanted a V8 without the terrible fuel economy of a big block, the 305 made perfect sense. A 1984 Camaro with the 305 and automatic transmission got 15 mpg city and 21 mpg highway. Compare that to a big block muscle car from the early 70s that struggled to get 10 mpg on the highway, and suddenly the 305 doesn't look so bad. So, here's the million-dollar question. Can you actually build a decent 305, or is it hopeless? The answer is yes, but with major caveats. Modern technology has changed the game. Aftermarket companies like TrickFlow now make cylinder heads specifically designed for small-bore engines. These heads use modern CNC porting and optimized valve angles to maximize airflow even with smaller valves. Combined with a proper camshaft, a good intake manifold, and modern fuel injection, a built 305 can make 300 horsepower or more without forced induction. A tested LB9 tuned port 305 that was upgraded with TrickFlow Super 23 cylinder heads, a CompCams camshaft, and a Holley Stealth Ram intake manifold jumped from 267 horsepower to 367 horsepower, a gain of 100 horsepower. That proves the 305 has potential when you throw the right parts at it. And here's another interesting fact. The 305 has found a second life in affordable sprint car racing. The Race Saver Sprint Car Series, launched in 1997, uses a Spec 305 engine with strict rules to keep costs down. The series has grown to over 1,000 cars and proves that the 305 can be competitive when everyone's running the same engine with the same limitations. But let's be realistic. From a pure cost to performance standpoint, building a 350 almost always makes more sense. The 350's larger bore means better airflow, more potential, and wider parts availability. You'll spend just as much money building a 305, but you'll make less power. That's just physics. The only time building a 305 makes sense is if you already have one in good condition, you're on a tight budget, and you just want a mild street engine with better manners than stock. Even then, most builders will tell you to save your money for a 350 or an LS swap. So, where does that leave us with the 305? This engine saved General Motors. During the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, when CAFE standards were crushing performance and customers still demanded V8s, the 305 stepped up. It kept V8 engines alive in GM's lineup when the company was seriously considering making the 305 the largest V8 you could buy and phasing out the 350 entirely. That almost happened. If it had, we might not have gotten the LT1 in the 1990s or the LS engines that followed. The 305 sold in massive numbers and gave millions of customers an affordable V8 experience. It powered police cars, work trucks, family sedans, and yes, even sports cars. It met emission standards, delivered reasonable fuel economy, and proved that you could build a V8 engine cheaply by sharing parts with larger engines. But the 305 also became a cautionary tale about compromise. In trying to meet regulations and cut costs, GM created an engine that frustrated enthusiasts, disappointed hot rodders, and became the butt of jokes. The small bore, tiny camshafts, and restricted airflow made it nearly impossible to build serious horsepower without major expense. And because the 350 was always available and better in almost every way, the 305 became known as the engine you got when you couldn't afford a real performance engine. The aftermarket support today proves that people still care about the 305, though. You can buy new cylinder heads, intake manifolds, camshafts, and complete engine rebuild kits. Companies are still making parts for this engine because there are millions of them still out there, running in classic trucks, G-body cars, and third-gen Camaros. The Chevrolet 305 V8 is one of the most misunderstood engines in American automotive history. It saved GM during the emissions crisis of the 1970s and 1980s. It powered some of the most iconic cars of that era. It proved that you could build an affordable, reliable V8 that met government standards while still giving customers what they wanted. But it also showed the limits of compromise. The 305 was never going to set the world on fire. It was never going to be a performance legend. It was a corporate solution to a corporate problem, and it did that job remarkably well. So the next time someone tells you the 305 is complete garbage, remember this. That garbage engine kept V8s alive when they were on life support. It gave millions of people an affordable V8 experience, and it helped GM survive long enough to develop the engines that would eventually dominate, like the LT1 and the LS series. The 305 wasn't the hero American car enthusiasts wanted, but for a brief moment in history, it was exactly the hero General Motors needed. If you've owned a 305 or still have one sitting in your garage, drop a comment and let me know your experience. Was it as bad as everyone says, or did it serve you well? And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of GM's most controversial engines, make sure you're subscribed for more classic American engine history. Thanks for watching.